Hi, you're listening to McMaster's Demystifying Medicine podcast series on Are We Born Racist?
Hi, Liz.
Hi, Asher.
I want to start today's podcast by talking about the recent incident with the death of George Floyd. Do you remember that incident?
Of course, it was basically all over the media and it was a serious concern.
Yes, it was the racist violence incident that a Caucasian police officer unreasonably killed this man named George Floyd. It happened on May 25th in Minneapolis in the United States of America. A video of this incident was posted on social media and made a lot of people feel enraged towards this racist incident executed by someone in a position of power.
Yeah, it was tragic. I believe that incident actually caused various Black Lives Matter movements across the world.
Yeah, it was even highlighted in the New York Times that Black Lives Matter may be the largest movement in the US history. The recent protests peaked on June 6. Half of a million people turned out in nearly 550 places across the United States. That added up to more than a month of protests. Neil Karen, an associate professor at the University of North Carolina, who studies social movements in the United States, said that I've never even seen self-reports of protest participation that high for a specific issue over such a short period of time.
Even Canadians actually held protests for Black lives lost by the incident. According to the CBC, following the movements in the USA, numerous marches happened in Ottawa, Toronto, Halifax, Regina, Vancouver, and many other locations. This movement involved thousands of people across the country.
Yeah, in addition to these protests, people have been showing anti-racism movements on social media, understanding that racism is a serious problem. Do you remember the Blackout Tuesday on several social media platforms?
Yes, of course. It was an initiative to go silent on social media on June 2nd, 2020. People want to show solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, which was originally launched by members of the music industry, Jamila Thomas and Brianna Ajamang, two Black women in the industry.
Beside that particular moment, I still see people caring more and talking more about racism in general.
Oh, I definitely agree.
Yeah, so this made me really wonder if people adapt racism or they're just born with it.
What do you mean?
Well, racism has been a prominent in our society for thousands of years. Discriminating others who physically look different commonly happened in our history. For example, the history of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was wondering, what if we are actually just born like that, to have racial bias towards those who look different? Maybe we're just genetically coded to be racist? Who knows?
That is definitely a very interesting question. And to be honest, to answer that question, we need to look into the development of people, especially when we're young. By learning about how we initially develop our preferences and behaviors, we might be able to answer your question.
Oh, really? That's interesting. Could you tell me more about it?
Yes, of course. Apparently, recent developmental studies investigating face recognition ability in infants have provided evidence not only that infants show selective attention to faces, but also that they can discriminate between faces from birth.
Wow. Is there anything more about this topic that you could tell me about?
Yeah, so according to the cool research conducted by Utska in 2013, they found that based on previous studies, infants older than 3 months of age suggests that a few months of experience with face leads to a more general preference for a certain categorical property of the face.
Oh, so they think that those selective characteristics in different races can affect their preference?
Basically, at approximately the age of 3 to 4 months, infants actually show a preference to faces of their own ethnic group. For instance, the research by Kelly and colleagues in 2005 reported that 3-month-old Caucasian infants liked looking at Caucasian faces over African, Middle Eastern, and Asian faces.
Hmm, that's interesting. Was this only found on Caucasian babies?
No, not at all. The same research also stated that Chinese 3-month-old infants in China preferred looking at Asian faces.
Wow, that's interesting. How about when they are a little bit older?
That's actually really cool that you asked me that question because I was reading a super interesting social experiment by Kinzer and Spelk, which tested the social preferences that was conducted with infants between the ages of 10 months to 5 years old.
So, what did you found about that study? What did it say?
Well, the 10-month-old baby took toys equally from their own races and other races. And then in 2.5 years, the children exhibited the same behavior and equally shared their toys. However, at 5 years old, the children expressed an explicit social preference towards just their own race.
So basically, they still had social preferences towards their own race when they're a little bit older.
Yeah, basically. However, we also need to understand that this primary preference in their early age is to develop appropriate attachment to their parents to basically survive. Several studies suggested that the existence of an own race recognition is advantage to the baby.
That's true.
But there is a finding by Barheem and colleagues in 2006 that showed that this kind of preference did not happen greatly in infants who have frequent exposure and social contact with members of another ethnic group.
Oh, that's very interesting. Well, that actually leads to the next topic that I wanted to talk about. So next, we'll talk about how the environment may affect the development of children and potentially be related to the racial bias in the later years. So, based on what we talked about previously, seems like racism undoubtedly often develops and causes very severe and tragic consequences in people's lives. You also mentioned how the environment can change the behavior of children, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, as one of the environmental factors, socioeconomic status is one of the biggest factors that relates to income, education, employment, community safety, social support, and much more. Was there any findings that in their socioeconomic status can affect their thoughts and behavior?
Well, to answer that question, one thing that they stated in a study by Ballas and Saville in 2016 is that face exposure during developmental stages determines the ability to recognize faces and how information could be processed. This can actually lead to category specific issues, including race. Based on this experiment, that looks into urban and rural communities, which can reflect socioeconomic statuses, they were actually able to find that the population of a hometown impacted the ability to identify variability in faces. So, they basically would not be able to recognize faces of other races and therefore could exhibit racist tendencies.
Really? Those are some really good points. I really like that study.
Yeah, yeah. In addition, in a different research paper published by Ballas and Sable, it stated that infrequent exposure to faces belonging to a certain racial category led to discrimination between members of those categories. In contrast to faces belonging to categories that dominate an observer's environment. Therefore, the environment that they were exposed to in their developmental stage can affect their behavior towards those who are different from them.
I did not think that the size of the city or where they can live affect children's behavior with other races. But that is very interesting to learn.
I thought so too. In another study I found, published by the American Academy of Pediatrics, called Race, Ethnicity, and Socioeconomic Status in Research on Child Health, actually recognized that early life experiences can shape the health across the life and across generations. They were actually able to realize that addressing disparities related to race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status must be prioritized.
Okay. So we know that children are not born racist, but in fact, child development factors can influence the children's behavior. So we know that socioeconomic status is a social determinant of health and includes factors such as occupation, education, income, wealth, and where someone lives. As stated by the World Health Organization, defined social determinants of health as the condition in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. Does socioeconomic status affects our society in terms of overall human functioning, including physical and mental health? And low socioeconomic status correlates with many aspects of life, such as lower education achievement, poverty, and poor health, which can be determinant to our society. So, unfortunately, inequalities in health, resource distribution, quality of life are increasing globally. So, it is important to understand how these factors affect the racial preferences, race, and socioeconomic status affect our overall health.
Yeah, right. Research suggests that the social environment in which children are raised shapes child and adolescent development. The article actually states that racism has a significant adverse effect on the individual who receives, commits, and also observes racism.
Yeah, exactly. That is a good point.
Yeah, we actually are very lucky today. Our colleague Kate invited a developmental pediatrician today to talk about this topic a little more in detail. This is kind of a perspective from someone who has some experience in the development of children.
Hi everyone, my name is Kate, and today I'm here with Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for speaking with us today. Could you please introduce yourself briefly for our listeners?
Hi, thank you very much for having me with you guys today. My name is Dr. Cassia Johnson, and professionally, I work currently as a developmental pediatrician. So that's a kids doctor that works with children and families that where the child has a neurodevelopmental difference, and I from that and my own life experience being of mixed race have started to think and wonder about the effects of racism on children's and families' health and well-being, which has led me down many different paths and given me the opportunity to be with you here today.
We just have been discussing the recent frequent incident of racism throughout the media, which led us to talk about different backgrounds on child development in relation to racism. We were just talking about how the environment that children live in can possibly affect their later perception on different race, potentially leading to developing racist bias. We were hoping to ask you several questions on this topic. To start off, what are some key factors in children's environment that often play a large role in shaping their pathways of thinking and behaving?
So when we're thinking about the influences on a child, and what makes someone grow into being an adult that engages in racist behavior instead of anti-racist behavior, we have to think about systemic racism because it's difficult to think. We often want to think that our ideas, our actions, and our thoughts are our own, but we're being acted upon by the systemic systems, systemically racist systems that are all around us. So those are through media, uh, healthcare, education. So there's the historical, social, and political concepts of racism that create the environment that we are born into.
That is a very interesting point on our current system. Continuing from that question, what environment would prevent racial bias and lead children to grow as anti racist children?
I think when we are raising little people to be anti-racist children and adults, they are brought up in an environment that asks them and encourages them to question the system, that shows them that change can happen, but asks them to question so that they're not taking in thoughts without wondering the background of them. And it's when we start questioning the system that we will start to dismantle it. And so when you ask what makes an anti racist adult, it's a child that's been raised in an environment that they've been encouraged to question the system, because prevention happens when we dismantle the system that will allow children to become anti-racist adults.
So, do you think there is anything that can be done to prevent the environment from affecting children on developing racial bias?
Um, so we talk about, resilience. And so we have to, do we want to make resilient people to a system that is trying to indoctrinate or get rid of them? So there's also the flip side of resilience, that we have to be resilient and surviving right now so we can question and dismantle the system. And so one of the things that we can do is proximity, have children in multiracial spaces where it's okay to talk about it. Kids are curious, ask questions, understand, learn. Environments where conversations, difficult and uncomfortable conversations, can be met with evidence, ideas, and science that is not laden in the systemically racist thoughts. And it's when we have proximity, conversation, read books, talk to people that are different, understand different perspectives. This is when we start to think about changing the personal so that we can move forward and change the system.
Wow, Dr. Johnson, that was very insightful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and knowledge with us today.
Wow, Dr. Johnson had some amazing points, and we're so fortunate to have a discussion with her about this emerging topic. Well, we are almost done for today's episode. Liz, do you have any final thoughts you want to add?
Yeah, I do. I actually really enjoyed Dr. Johnson's insight on this topic. And I was actually reading another CBC article titled How to Raise Anti Racist Kids. Don't Be a Racist Parent. This article dived into this question of how parents can raise kids that don't grow up racist. But it was actually found that there is no secret ingredient to raise anti racist kids. However, the route to have kids that are inherently anti racist comes from the parents. Children are actually a mirror and reflection of their parents. Moving forward, this article encourages parents to take a good look at their friend group and let their kids know that diversity in friendship is okay. Parents need to take steps to diversify their kids' play environment by having diverse skin types for toys, as well as books that include both Black and Brown children. Another practice that is suggested is saying hi to neighbors of color. This creates a connection between different ethnic groups and shows kids that it is okay to associate with other races.
Wow, I definitely agree with that. I know this question is very open minded, but I guess what we're trying to communicate in this podcast is ultimately racist tendencies aren't inherited, however, they're learned behaviors.
Yeah, exactly. This is a much needed conversation, and I feel like we are much more aware of this issue. This is a small stepping stone in making a bigger change. Well, I guess that's all the time we have for today, folks.
Well, thank you for joining us on today's podcast. Don't forget to always be kind to another, especially during these times. And please feel free to check out other podcasts and YouTube videos on Demystifying Medicine channel.